Hey, it's Melissa from the Macrame Public Library. This month we are making some really fun take and make macrame hanging jars. Want to see them? We're going to make these. Super fun, perfect in time for summer. You can put a bunch of different things in here. If you have little tiny succulent plants, they'd be adorable in here. Maybe some air plants, which are fun little plants that just grow in air, which is amazing in itself. If you have battery operated tea lights, that would be great in here. No real tea lights, flames would catch the ropes on fire, be safe. You can put a lot of different things in here. So we hope that when you're done making these, you'll share what you put in them, how you made them, where you're hanging them. We'd love to see them. So are you ready to get started? If you're able to stop by the library and grab a take and make kit, then you have everything you need except a pair of scissors. You might also want a piece of tape or a heavy book. I'll show you where you could use those if you have them. Not required, just makes it a little bit easier. If you weren't able to get a take and make kit, you might have what you need at home. You just need a glass jar and some sort of rope. I think even a thick yarn would work for this. You don't need to have a wooden ring for a hanger. You can just tie a loop there and make it as just a knot with the string too. All right, let's get started. First thing you need to do is get the rope ready. So what you're going to do is find the two ends. This is one big long piece of rope. So you're going to find the two ends, put them together, and then find the other end of the rope. It might be a little bit tangled, but it should come untangled pretty easily. So just keep working your way down until you find the end. Let's see here. I thought I had my rope all piled relatively neatly. No. All right. Okay, phew, there it is. So this is the middle of my rope. Essentially what we're doing is we're folding it in half, okay? So there's the middle, so keep that on your thumb or however you want to keep it. And we're gonna go back and find those two ends again. So now I'm just pulling the rope the other direction to find where I started with my two ends. There we go, there they are. So now take that in that hand so that you've got two loose ends and the middle loop. Hold on to that. Got those in this hand, again, pull in to find the end. It might get a little tangled on the way, but straighten that out. There we go, there's the other end. So two loops in this end, one loop, two ends in this end. Put them together. There, essentially we have folded our rope in half, twice. Okay, so now you have, here we go, if I hold this up like this, one end that's got four loops. That's this is the middle of your ropes. And the other side has three loops and two loose ends. The side that has the three loops and two loose ends, take that. Put it in front of you. I'm just gonna set it out here so that you see what I mean by the loops. So I've got three loops and two loose ends. We're gonna cut these three loops so that we end up with 8 loose ends, okay? So again, before you cut, make sure you're on the side that has the two ends already, okay? So 2 ends, 3 loops. I'm just gonna cut these loops just like this, very precise. Okay, so now you've got 8 loose ends, right? Kind of line them up. These actually worked out pretty well. They don't have to be perfect, it just helps in the long run if they're relatively close in length. Grab a hold of that, grab this end. So now you've got essentially 4 individual pieces of rope, but we never really use them as individuals. So we're just gonna put them together. So got my loops, got my ends. The loops, I'm gonna set down like this in front of me. These ends, I'm just gonna set to the side for now. Okay, now you're gonna take your wooden ring. We're gonna set the wooden ring on top of the loops, like this, and we're gonna pull the loops, all 4 loops, through the wooden ring, this. So I'm just pulling them through. And then I'm going to make a circle over the top of the 8 strings, right? See that? Okay, so hopefully this gives you a little bit better view of what I meant. So we've got the loop here. I'll actually just do it again. So got the ring, we've got the loops. I take the ring, I set it on top and I pull these 4 loops through, down a little bit. I kind of squish the ropes underneath together. Together. So I've got this. And here I take a little time and I kind of line these things up so that they're not all completely twisted. Again, things are going to get twisted as we go, but I like to start out with things the least twisted, I guess. All right, so I'm going to line this rope. There we go. Get it kind of in order so these lay relatively flat there. And you've got those coming up. So now we're going to attach this to our wooden ring. And the way I do that, there's a bunch of ways, and you can do it any way that works for you, but I go this way, and then I take these middles and I pull up until I get those ends all the way through. So now I've got my middle 8 ropes over the top of this loop. I hold on to the ring and I pull. Not super tight because I want to take time to straighten things out again. Try to get these to lie relatively nicely on top of the ring. Again, doesn't have to be perfect, but just taking a little time here. Straighten things out and then pull. All right, so now you've got this attached. Some people like to see this side up. Some people like to see this side up. I am a this side up sort of person. So what I do is I look at this side and see, okay, it's a little bit wonky here. So I'm just going to take my time, kind of straighten it out a little bit. Straighten these out a little bit. Again, doesn't have to be perfect. I just like it to look a little bit tidy. Sorry. So there we go. It's a little tidier now. All right. So as you can see, not super perfect, totally fine. No one's going to be looking at the ring anyway. They're going to be looking at your awesome jar with your macrame. All right. So now we get to move to the next step, which is tying our first knots. Again, I'm going to switch camera angles. I know it's probably annoying, but I think it works easier for you to be able to see what I'm doing. All right. Now that you have your rope attached to your wooden ring, it's almost time to start tying the knots. So I mentioned a piece of tape or a heavy book would come in handy. This is the time. So if you have tape, if you put a piece of tape right here and secure this down to your table, it will help when you're tying knots to keep things neat and orderly. If you don't have tape, but you happen to have a large book, which I do, you can use a book. If you're going to use a book, use a Mount Horeb author. This is Jim Leary's book. It's filled with great words and works out really well as well for holding onto this craft. So I just put it on top of the wooden ring and that holds it down. So now we are going to make little pairs with our strings. We're going to neaten them up first. They get kind of tangled. And I try to do it so that when I'm lying these out, that the ropes aren't all tangled at the top. So I kind of go in the order that they come off of that wooden ring. So I've got one set there, and then I'm going to take the next 2, and this one looks like it wants to go here instead, so I'm going to do that. So I've got a pair, and a pair. All right, so now you have to decide where you want your jar to sit. Depends on how much rope you want at the top and the bottom. It doesn't really matter. When I was experimenting, I made some that were really tall up here and the jar was down here. I didn't think that looked right in the place that I hung it. And then I made some really short ones, which are also cute, but harder to reach the jar. So it's all up to you. I ended up doing about 15 inches from the knot down. And the way I measured, very, very scientifically, is I took a piece of paper. I know the pieces of paper are 11 inches long. And I lined it up with the top knot here. And I know that this is 11 inches. And so then I just added a couple more, like boat to there. And I figured that's about 15 inches, and that seemed to work well for me. But again, this is totally up to you. The only thing you have to make sure is that you leave enough down here to be able to have your jar, about like that, and enough to tie a knot at the bottom to hold the jar. Okay, so make sure you don't start way down here. It's not going to work. Okay. Now I made my pairs all silly when I was trying to tell you that. Let me straighten them back out again. All right, again, just making pairs and trying to have it so that the pairs of rope are about in the order that they come off that wooden ring or they're not. All right, so first knot. Again, I'm going to use my piece of paper here, and I know it's 15 inches is about here. Again, doesn't have to be perfect. I take my 2 pieces of rope, and I just tie a very basic loop knot. It's probably the first knot we all learned how to make, right? Just looks like that. And then I'm going to go back down to the table and I'm going to scoot this up to about that 15-inch, 14-inch mark. Doesn't, again, have to be very precise. There we go. Now I get rid of this because now for my next 3 knots, I'm just going to line them up with this first knot that I tied. So I'm going to take this one, and the way I do that to line it up is I make sure it's nice and loose when I make the loop, and then I can scooch it up or down to line up with this one. Make sure when you're lining them up that your ropes up here are relatively straight. If your rope is like this and you line up your knot with this knot here, when you pull them out, they won't line up. All right, so just try to make sure that they're about straight and even on the top. And it looks about good. And I take the next one, do the same thing. Quick little knot, pull it through. Oh, I pulled too hard. So I'm just gonna straighten this out a little bit. There we go. Okay, let's see, this looks about right. The nice thing about this material, this rope, this is 3mm macrame cord, and it comes untied relatively easy as well. So if you get a knot in here and you decide that that is really not lined up how you want it, you can untie it and redo it, which is great. I did try to make these with thinner rope because I thought, oh, they're small jars, we should use thinner rope. It did not work well, and it was not fun to work with. So I recommend 3mm at least, okay? All right, so there's my 4 knots. So the next step is we're going to tie more knots, but we're going to tie pieces of rope to each other. So to do that, I'm going to take these outside pieces and set them over here because we're not going to use those yet. That's going to be in the very last when we tie. All right, so then, but what we're going to do, again, I'm going to open these up so that I have my ropes nice and straight and lined up. We're going to tie a knot here and here and here, okay? But it does matter how long of a knot it is because the jar will fall through if they're not the right size. So on your instruction sheets, or if you happen to just be doing this at home and you have a measuring tape or something, somewhere on your instruction sheets, you're going to have something that looks like this and it says 2.5 inches. So we're going to use this 2.5-inch mark to tie our knots, okay? So the way I do that is I slide this piece of paper right underneath the ropes, okay? And again, we're not using this one first. We're setting that one over there. And I'm going to line my top of my 2.5-inch mark up with my first knot here. Okay, so here are the first knots that I tied. And again, we're using this string, getting it out of the way. We're not using that one, so we're starting with the second one. So I take my 2.5-inch measurement here and I line this top of it up with this knot, all right? And now I'm going to take this string here and I'm going to tie a knot right here, okay? So I just take these two and again, I just make my little loop, make it nice and loose, and so that way I can slide it up or down depending on where you started to get my knot at the end of that 2.5-inch mark, okay? Now this doesn't have to be exactly 2.5 inch. It just works best if you're pretty close to that. Okay, so there, I just tied that and you can see it's pretty close. There's the top of my line and there's the bottom of my line. All right, so to make it even a little closer, I noticed it was a little bit short. When I tighten it, I just pull down. All right, so then there's that one. You're making macrame now. All right, so then I just slide my measure in paper over and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take this rope and tie the knot right here. If you don't want to keep using the measuring paper, if it's a little too hard for you, you can just line this one up with this knot. That works just fine too. So again, I made this one nice and loose so that I can adjust it before I get it nice and tight. All right, does that make sense? Start out nice and loose so you can move it around. Okay, there we go. And you can see, so I lined it up with this one, but the knots do line up. All right, so then we've got next string over. Same deal. Line it up so the top of the knot is at the top of that 2.5-inch mark. I'm going to take those two and make a loose loop. Line it up and just tighten it so that they line up as well. or pretty close. Okay, so now we've got these 3 nice knots right there. What do we do with these? Same thing, we're gonna pick them up, we're going to bring them together on top of these, and we're gonna tie that 2.5 inch. I'm gonna get rid of the paper now because it doesn't help me right now, it's more in my way. So now we're gonna tie the knot in these 2 outside pieces to be the same distance from this knot to this knot as the ones below, okay? So we're gonna just take these 2, these are the 2 outside pieces. We're gonna make our knot here, and we're just gonna line it up with these knots below here. All right, so I'm just gonna scoot that and tighten it up. All right, so now look at that. Oh, it looks like macrame already. Pretty awesome. You only have 1 more knot to do, okay? You can be fancier here. If you want to start adding some other, like if you have beads or something, feel free to, you can throw beads along in this process. We're gonna tie 1 more knot, and then if you wanna get fancy after that, we can do some other things. All right, so I'm gonna put this piece of paper back under here because you'll find that along with your 2.5 inch marks, there's a 1.5 inch mark. Again, for these jars, I found that measuring this bottom knot was also really helpful, and I found that 1.5 inches worked best to hold the jar in place. So I'm lining this 1.5 inch mark up with this second row of knots that we tied, and I'm gonna grab all of these, the whole thing, and I'm going to tie 1 gigantic knot. So to do that, I just take all of them, I wrap them around my hand, make a nice big opening in there, and pull them through. And again, it's nice and loose so that I can adjust here. Let me scoot this down. So I can adjust where it ends up so that it ends up being at that 1.5 inch mark below our second line of knots. All right. This one's kind of tricky because there's so many ropes here, and you want it to look kind of nice and tidy. So let's see, is that about there? We're close. And then I pull it tight. Okay. So technically we're done. But if you want to get more, I don't know, fancy, if you really were enjoying this, this is all extra right now, okay? So you have the opportunity to go crazy with your knots. If you want to add some more, I'll show you one that I did in a minute. I added some more knots to these. I did some single knots. I did a couple of double knots. You can do anything you want. If this is good enough for you, then you can trim this however you want, wherever you'd like it to be. If you want it to be long, if you want it to be shorter, that's up to you. You can braid it, you can do all kinds of stuff. Again, if you have beads, it'd be really fun. You could throw some wooden beads on here. It's all up to you. So again, mine's really long because I started my knots at about 15 inches. Had I started down farther, then it would be shorter, right? I just wanted to make sure that you had enough rope that you could play around and make them however long you wanted. All right, so now it's time to put your jar into your rope thing, into your macrame hanger. I actually find this to be more difficult than I think it probably should be, but for some reason I have a hard time getting this in here. So what I do is I set the jar upside down. I take my macrame rope and I hang it upside down so that the final big gigantic knot is right here. And then I spread the knots that we tied apart and I stick it over the top of the jar so that this big knot is on the bottom and pretty well centered. And then I just arrange the knots that we tied all around the jar, kind of trying to make sure that they are kind of centered as well in the middle of the jar. And then I grab a hold of the ropes and the jar in one hand. And these are my tails that I haven't cut off yet. And so now I picked it up and I take this hand and I pull these ropes tight and then carefully flip it over. All right. It should be in there pretty good, but, well, it will fall out, obviously. It's not glued in or anything, so be careful. It's not super duper secure. And then I just kind of adjust it a little bit so that that middle is pretty close to the middle of the bottom of the jar. Sometimes you just kind of have to wiggle your knots around a little bit till they get to be where you want them to be. Now, if when you get to this point, after you do a little more arranging, you feel like your knots aren't where you want them, for example, this one is lower than this one, and if that bothers you, you can untie this one still right where it is, just loosen it up and you can scoot it up. All right, so it's a nice and relatively forgiving. So as we said, we have all this on the bottom. So you can cut this off here if you'd like to, which I think is already really cute, just cutting it like that. If you're really wanting to get really macrame-like, is that a verb? I don't know. Here's one that I did. Again, I've never done macrame. There's a lot fancier things you can do. So this one on the bottom, sorry, I don't have it quite lined up in there. I tied a bunch of other knots, right? So I just did single knots in various places, just to make it a little bit even fancier. Again, if you have beads or something on here, I think that'd be really cute. You could put beads on these ropes before you actually tie your first knots. That would also be really cute. All right. So if you made one of these, we would love to see it. Feel free to send us a picture at mhpl@mounthorwi.info or put it on Facebook and tag MHPL News. It's really fun for us to see what you all make. So thank you so much for joining us for our April Take and Make, and hopefully we'll see you in the library soon. Bye.